A bell does not ring so much as settle. One note floats across frost and finds the hinges of your attention. The lane grows smaller, lamplit, smoke threads from low roofs, and writes the same sentence on every house. We are awake, but only a little. You pull the nightcloth like a shawl, and notice details, stories, skip the scratch of wool, the clean bite of air, the leather latch that remembers winters. Witchcraft is a loud word. Tonight, we speak quietly. We'll walk past broom legends and ask softer questions. What did people actually do on long evenings when luck felt wobbly? Which prayers sat beside which charms? Who kept the right words in a pocket? And why did that matter in places where not everyone read the page but many read the year? Before the press sold fear by the sheet, life moved by bells and fields. There were saints' days, market days, and nights when a mother tied thread on her wrist because her own mother had done so and it seemed to help. We won't chase monsters, we'll watch hands and let myths wait while facts lower your shoulders into rest. The bell doesn't shout, it settles like snow. Frost draws neat stitches along the lane. A door closes with a strip of wool between wood and wood, and the sound makes even the stars feel domesticated. One window keeps a small promise for the street, and wood smoke writes, a line across the roof ridges. If you listen, you can hear wool cloak against sleeve, that quiet scratch that says people decided to be warm together and let the world postpone its larger problems. This is a small town that thinks in circles. Well to church, church to market, market to oven, oven to table, table to sleep. Life takes its cues from bells and fieldwork. The church calendar stitches months like a patient seamstress fasting that teaches restraint. Feasts that loosen shoulders. Saints' days that turn weather into anniversaries. No one checks a screen. The year is a serviceable clock. If you forget, a neighbor remembers, and the bell reminds, without hurry. The square, which is really a widening of the lane, has a trough that knows every voice. The church sits slightly skewed, like a careful ant who sees down both alleys at once. By day it organizes notices and quarrels. By night it keeps breath. Inside, stone is cool and beeswax sweet. Outside, the bell rope rests like a tired arm. Its last note has folded into the frost and will not return until the hour asks kindly. For now, the town leans into hushed reading. Here is plural. Some people read parchment, more read seasons. A boy who cannot sign his name can read a cloud and tell you whether hay will behave by noon. A woman might not pass a Latin page, yet she knows the words that calm a child and the measure of time that settles a stomach. Knowing the right words matters even when letters are few. Words travel by mouth, by habit, by song. Literacy is also elbows, baskets, sunrise, and the bell's steady grammar. At a lintel, you notice a pilgrim badgetine pressed into a tiny saint or sklepung, with a thread that once closed a loaf. It is less a command to the universe than a pocketable memory of courage. Someone walked and returned. Over a bed, a verse is stitched into linen, not to impress visitors, but to hold a rhythm at eye level when worry arrives. A mother ties red thread around a wrist and says it helped her sister. The baby sleeps, and nobody argues with sleep. Witchcraft is not the word of this lane, not tonight. People speak in smaller terms. Luck, blessing, the off day, when the cow's milk tasted like a cloud got lost. When misfortune visits, the first suspect is weather, the second is tiredness, the third is a decision everyone agrees to undo tomorrow. If explanation fails, rumor walks, but it pays toll at thresholds. Reputation is a kind of local physics. Those who greet, lend, and laugh lightly bend misfortune's path away more often than toward. Walk past the smithy where the anvil sleeps under leather. A horseshoe rises to a doorway, practical metal placed where drafts might be persuaded to mind manners. Across the lane, the midwife's window is dark but well remembered. Her basket holds herbs with names that sound like neighbors, and linen, ready to wrap the new or bind the sprained. Sources suggest such experts were valued more often than feared. Status flowed from results, and from the stories people told while shelling peas at the well. A board keeps the bucket from bold ideas. A sign in painted letters asks for care. Not everyone reads the line with eyes, but all read it with hands. A child traces the curve of an S as if it were a path over the hill, and says the word correctly anyway. Measures live in bodies. The L, from elbow to wrist, the pace between door and gate. The weight, that says a sack is generous, but still liftable. The town stays literate by touch. Look upward. The sky is a colleague. The church calendar folds the heavens into habitat vent teaching. Patience, Lent teaching appetite to wait. Rogation, days walking the bounds and blessing fields. On such mornings, people marked their parish by feet and words. Tie a sprig at a corner tree, and greet the wind without trying to boss it. It isn't theater. It's administration by walking, and sleep afterwards feels like wages honestly earned. The bell approves with notes that arrive like nods. Inside cottages, quiet remedies keep their stations. A mortar remembers, which leaves comfort a sulking stomach. A written charm, copied by a clerk for a coin and a favor, naps under a bowl because its job is steady, not showy. Someone hums a psalm at the boil, not to rearrange the clouds, but to arrange their own breathing. A man wears a small token of a saint whose story suits his work. It is less a spell than an introduction he keeps making to his better self. Now and then a traveler passes, rich in tales and poor in shoe. He trades a planting rhyme for supper, and the rhyme is your grandmother's advice in a new hat. Fear still exists in barns when cows sicken, in cradles when a cough lingers, in skies that forget to be reasonable, but it is met first with sweeping, sharing, and company at the threshold. Two people are heavier than worry. Under the same sky, people mix prayer with small protections. A badge that looks like a tiny shell stops a fever. A string with 3 knots quiets a worry. A line of words, folded into linen, promises sleep. Do they work? The lane answers with a shrug and a smile. They belong to the house. The way the kettle does. Start with the hat, because hats tell good stories. On market days you see tin badges pinned along the brim. Little saints, a cross, sometimes a scallop that means someone walked far and returned. A pilgrim badge is part souvenir, part certificate, part courage that you can touch. It says, we visited a shrine, we asked for help, we kept going. Worn on the hat, hung by the bed, sewn into a child's cap for a season. These tokens are less about commanding the universe and more about joining a queue of hope. The church often smiled at such journeys, especially when the badge brought someone's best self back home. Now the doorframe, someone has drawn a sign in chalk near the latch. It will rinse away in rain and then it will return. On the inside, near the hinge, a sprig of rowan or a ribbon of red thread rests exactly where a grandmother's hand would land. Not everyone names these things magic. Most call them customs, or simply the way. A cradle, new to the house, receives a quiet gift, a prayer lightly stitched along its skirt, a verse that takes 2 breaths to read and leaves the 3rd breath calmer than the first. On the table, beeswax candles bloom their soft honeyed perfume. Beside them, a folded scrap of parchment naps under a spoon. Open it, and the ink shows brief. Tidy Latin perhaps, a psalm verse, perhaps the beginning of a gospel, perhaps a short prayer mixed with someone's name and the date it was written. Such written charms traveled from scribe to house the way bread travels from oven to table. They were copied for a coin or returned with a favor, sometimes authorized by the local priest, sometimes merely tolerated with a reminder to keep the heart pointed in the right direction. Scholars debate the boundaries, but neighbors mostly remember whether the child slept better and the cow stopped sulking. Relics live at larger scale in stone places. A church that keeps a box with a name on it, a fragment or a contact cloth, a glass vial with oil that touched a shrine. Pilgrims bring handkerchiefs to press against the reliquary, then carry them home like condensed stories. People line up not because they want a shortcut, but because they've learned to ask for help where help has been asked before. A village might parade its relic on a day when crops need courage, and nobody laughs. The earth gets its blessing, the parish gets its walk, and the path becomes part of the memory that holds the year together. Attitudes in pulpits and manuals varied. A sermon might praise trust in God, and side-eye formulas muttered as if buying luck at a stall. Pastors were told to warn against superstition, practices that treated holy things like levisit. Pastoral advice often came with gentleness. Correct the purpose, keep the kindness, bless the herbs. Yes, don't pretend the words push the planets. One monk writes that a psalm is medicine because it turns the heart. Another warns not to confuse the wrapper for the gift. The debate is old and calm rather than theatrical. Meanwhile, houses keep being houses. A mother steeped thyme and honey for a cough, not because a treatise demanded it, but because her aunt did, and because thyme grows obediently on the corner of the garden and smells like last July. She adds a whispered line she knows by heart, not to force an outcome but to hold her breathing steady while the child sips. In the glove of carob and palm, steam rising, the prayer serves as lining. If the cough eases, nobody writes a chapter about it. If it lingers, a neighbor walks to the cottage with a different leaf and a longer psalm. Not all protections hang from threads. Iron itself reassures. A knife placed near the cradle points quietly at the fact that iron resists rust when tended and mice dislike being supervised. A broom across the threshold is both a signal that the floor has just been persuaded into virtue and a casual gate that says, "Step over with courtesy." Later centuries will tell livelier stories about brooms. In kitchen light, a broom remains exactly what it is, the household's second spine. Literacy feels larger than letters. A clerk with a quill can copy a verse, but an old woman can recite it in a storm when the candle fails. A charm might be written for someone who cannot read. Each letter, they will still know how to fold it and where to tuck it. Knowing the right words includes knowing when to say them, how to say them, and why you're saying anything at all. Motives matter, said the preacher. And most listeners nodded because motives already mattered in every other part of life: trade, marriage, planting. Apologies. You will find small collections everywhere. Pouches of herbs sorted like a tiny apothecary. A rosary polished by thumb and worry. A badge, a relic cloth, a bead shaped like a gourd for good harvest talk. These nests of objects are biographies of hope. Some items face the church without friction. Others sit in a gray zone watched by pastoral eyes that prefer teaching to scolding. The household takes the hint. It thanks the saint out loud and thanks the herb under its breath, and calls both gratitude. Neighbors consult neighbors. The one who remembers moon cycles suggests setting bean poles after a certain feast. The one who reads the almanac says the moon doesn't mind, but tides do. Everyone keeps old weather proverbs because they rhyme well and commit to memory without rent. If a cow's milk sours, the first thought is pasture. The second is pale, and only later, if nothing else makes sense, comes a cup of talk about who quarreled with whom. Before trouble can dress itself up as a tale, someone invites everyone to share a loaf. Food is an underrated protective charm. Inside the church, beeswax warmth is joined by page rustle. Here, two words live in careful shapes. A homily might quote a caution about empty formulas, then pivot to praise for patient care of neighbors. A priest sees charms on wrists and badges on hats every week, and chooses his verbs accordingly. Blessing, not bargaining. Trust, not transaction. The same hands that light candles also wash feet, sweep aisles, mend cloaks. The aisle becomes a lesson. Holy things are in the hands, as well as in the words. Sometimes objects hide in houses where later, carpenters discovered them: a shoe in a wall, a bottle with pins, a child's cap tucked under a stair. Sources suggest such concealments were more common in later centuries. Practices shifted by region and time. People kept wanting homes to be lucky though, and kept doing small, private things that made rooms feel braver. The important part was rarely the mechanism. It was the quiet chorus. We care, we remember, we hope together. You could call this magic. Most would call it maintenance of the heart. A badge to remember courage, a verse to tame breath, a candle to make darkness obey. The town keeps its ledger of kindness in these forms. And while homes whisper, pages argue in the margins. From homes to manuscripts the learned wade in too. A woman says she flew. The scribe does not gasp. He reaches for a quill, breathes in the clean sting of ink, and writes a sentence that has calmed a lot of rooms. Teach her, don't panic. In a library that smells of vellum and beeswax, where footsteps are softened by rushes and by the good manners of sandals on stone. A monk copies a short passage that will travel far under many covers. Later readers will call it the canon episcopi, not a single book but a paragraph that keeps hitchhiking through law collections. Its tone is older cousin, not town crier. It says, in the tidy style of people who prefer order, that some folk claim to ride by night with a lady called Diana, sometimes named differently in other places, Herodias, or a local figure, and that these rides are illusions. The task for pastors, the text adds, is to correct gently and turn minds back to steadier paths. Notice what it does not do. It does not stage a hunt. It does not demand the square at noon. It does not fold fear into spectacle. It files the matter. Under cateches's belief, needing teaching, in the margin, a note appears. A miniature sermon on the difference between dreams that feel like travel and travel that actually empties a bed. The scribe dots an I, half smiles, and lets the choir down the hall finish a psalm that ends like a good paragraph, quietly and complete. The night ride wasn't invented by one village. Stories about processions across the sky drift through a lot of winters. Some people called it the wild hunt, a roaring host. Other places imagined a leader more household-sized, a lady with a ring of nightwalkers, a procession that slips through keyholes, an excursion that leaves no footprints. If you've ever woken from a dream so convincing that morning had to argue with you, you know how such tales feel. The canon's author also knew that feeling, and wrote as if to say, strong dream, stronger daylight. The word choice matters. The paragraph calls the rides false, deceptive, not because it hates story, but because it loves bodies. Bodies live in beds, carry water, knead dough, stand in fields. If a neighbor swears she floated and crossed roofs and danced in a ring, the canon proposes a diagnosis, not a drama. She was misled, more likely asleep, perhaps caught in overlapping beliefs, perhaps proud of a story that made attention bend toward her. Pastors are instructed to teach the difference between visions and visits. Penances belong to the category learn and adjust, not make an example. The tone is pastoral rather than punitive. Watch the parchment, receive the words. A line mentions a goddess from older memory, Diana, in this copy. But the point is less the name than the caution. Don't grant a dream the status of geography. The paragraph travels into handbooks that clergy carry in their heads, and sometimes in their sleeves. When they make rounds through lanes after lamplight, they carry these sentences like tools, a phrase to unknot, a frightening tale, a calm to place over a household that tenses at rumors. In another room, a different compiler puts similar counsel into a list of questions for confessors. Have you boasted that you joined a night company? Have you taught others to do likewise? The remedy offered is time, prayer, and new habits, not spectacle. Sources suggest that in these texts the concern is often less secret coven and more misdirected devotion, the way a clever children's rhyme can rewrite a memory and make it seem older than it is. The choir's next piece rises. The scribe scratches. Sandals pause at the doorway, then continue past. Let's walk from the scriptorium to a lane we know. A neighbor says that milk went wrong, and that someone, somewhere, rides at night. The local priest has read the canon. He has also milked goats. He asks the useful questions first. Which pasture? Which pail? What mood was the cow in? He prays, yes, because that is his job, and because prayer helps breathing, and because households expect it. He also recommends a different shelf for the bucket, and a calmer bedtime. He may, depending on region and temperament, add a short talk about stories that borrow old goddess names and turn free-floating fear into tight conclusions. Then he schedules the next bell like you schedule tea for a friend who worries. This does not mean medieval people rolled their eyes at everything unusual. They had rich imaginations, and so do we. It means that one of their widely copied paragraphs advised leaders to meet vivid stories with patient teaching. In that teaching, the body keeps its vote. Did she truly fly? The canon says no. Did she have a powerful interior experience? The canon would call it delusion, a word from its time for the mind misled. Either way, the recommended remedy is not a torch. It's a sermon, a season of guidance, and a return to the works of mercy that keep a town in one piece. Listen again to the language. It does not invite us to picture midnight assemblies. It invites us to picture a pastor in a doorway, hearing a complicated story, and choosing verbs like explain, counsel, restore. The scribes who copied this text were not staging plays. They were building indexes of calm. If you want the medieval equivalent of a thread, this is it, a line that appears in collection after collection. curbing the appetite for frenzy. Other compilers in later centuries will argue, some more nervously, some more sternly, but in the broader medieval habitus, this particular counsel held a place. Treat night rides as dreams and keep parishioners within the safety rails of ordinary life. If you prefer a homely metaphor, the canon is a lid placed on a pot that tends to boil over in retellings. It does not deny that people have strange nights. It denies the geography of those nights and protects the geography of the lane. Back in the library, the choir's final chord thins into quiet. The scribe sands the note he blotted and lifts the page to the rack. Ink fades from shine to matte. Somewhere a bell marks the hour with the soft confidence of a house that knows its furniture. The sandals return, pass, and fade. On the shelf, the paragraph waits for its next life under another binding. Centuries on, pamphlets will shout and pictures will leap. For now, the instruction stands. Night rides are stories to be corrected, not prosecutions to be staged. The law, such as it is in this moment, concerns itself with teaching more than with theater. And since teaching has a cousin called procedure, the next question arrives like a careful knock on a wooden door. If tales could mislead, how did law handle suspicions? Say next when you'd like to follow that knock down the hall. She smells like time and clean linen, not smoke and rumor. When a wrist bends wrong or a baby decides on midnight, the lane does not look for capes. It looks for this door. The first magic is that she knows your name and your mother's soup. Her cottage is an index of practical kindness. Bundles of herbs hang in careful rows, labeled in a handwriting that learned from seasons more than schools. A mortar waits with the patient dignity of a tool that never performs for applause. Linen whispers on a peg where bandages dry flat and honest. If a traveler walked in expecting a cauldron's thunder, they would be disappointed. The loudest sound is the mortar's tap. The second loudest, the soft readjustment of a cat. She is called wise woman here, but a wise man in the next parish does similar work. Titles are local. The work is the same. Listen, touch, steady, bone setting, begins with looking. She turns a farmer's wrist in her hands like a question, reads swelling the way others read clouds, and answers with two smooth sticks, a measure of padded wool, a wrap of linen that hums slightly as it is pulled snug. Move the fingers, she says, and the farmer does. A capable hand, now on holiday. He pays with a skein of yarn and a promise to saw firewood, which is a currency the cottage always accepts. Birth is a craft and a vigil. When the bell is not yet thought of and the moon has decided to stay, she arrives with a basket that rattles lightly, swaddling bands rolled tight, a small jar of oil that remembers olives and sun, a cloth stitched with a short verse because breath behaves better when the mouth has something calm to say. The birthing stool is placed where heat is friendly and privacy is not theatrical. The household's women gather, a neighbor warms water. The father cuts bread in tentative slices that somehow come out equal. The midwife counts without counting, listens to the rhythm a body keeps, and offers words that make time feel shorter and courage feel closer. Sources suggest midwives held standing, shaped by reputation. They were mostly valued because results were obvious and gratitude noisy. Later centuries will print stranger claims. Here, tonight, a cry appears, then another, and linen begins its second job. Herb lore is a long conversation. Thyme for stubborn throats. Yarrow for small nicks that need to reconsider. Comfrey reserved with caution, because some plants don't mind a warning label. Fennel to coax appetite back from its sulk. She sends people home with a pouch of leaves, and the instruction to breathe while water steams. The instructions often include a line of prayer, not as a lever to move stars but as a rhythm to keep hope from wobbling. Parish priests vary in mood. Many bless the herb basket at certain feasts, or at least bless the hands that use it. Words like superstitio and proper devotion are discussed in sermons, but at the cottage the distinction sounds like this: don't boss heaven. Make soup. Knowledge travels like bread recipes. An aunt teaches a niece to feel fever at the wrist, and not only on the forehead. A tanner shows how to make a salve from fat, rendered clean, and resin strained free of bark. A clerk scribbles a psalm on a scrap for a charm that sits under a pillow, because sleep arrives sooner when the mind has a short road to walk. None of this claims to overturn the world. All of it aims to steady it. Payment is a choreography of decency. Coin happens, but often a new comb, a patch of cloth, a future afternoon of labor, is the answer to what do I owe. Mercy is its own ledger. The poor are mended and sent with a blessing that does not embarrass them at the door. Reputation is worth more than coin in a street this size. When strangers mutter about witches, locals look at splints and full cradles and become suddenly hard of hearing. Does everyone approve? Mostly. Jealousies exist. Someone's cow failed. Someone's pride bruised. Someone found the verse in the bandage and worried it was too cozy with power. But the lane's law is results plus kindness. The wise woman knows the lines not to cross. No muttered curses for hire, no boasting about night rides, no theater that makes the priest's eyebrows stage a sermon. She keeps her sentences tidy. This leaf helps. This will pass. I will come back in the morning. Not all healers are women, and not all knowledge wears herbs. A village bone-setter might be a miller with the sure hands flour taught him. A barber may be cautious with a blade and competent with simple leeching when fashion and theory asked for it. University men in towns argue about humors hot and cold, wet and dry, and sometimes their advice arrives by cousin with a travel story and a prescription for rest and broth. The wise woman nods. Broth is a language she speaks. Sometimes, because rumor and winter are friends, a dispute tumbles into a complaint. A fee was too high, says one mouth. A promise was not kept, says another. At such moments, the cottage has a prepared humility. She goes to the church porch, answers questions clearly, offers to return a jar, and reminds the clerk with the quill that she also volunteers at the baptistry, and that her hands have swaddled half the street. Sources suggest there was no blanket persecution of midwives in the medieval period. Standing depended on neighbors and on the habit of not mixing help with spite. Listen to the room when no one is ill. It smells of dried summer, chamomile that refuses to stop being sunny, lavender that teaches the air to behave, the clean nutty note of linen warmed and folded. The mortar taps twice to argue with a stubborn seed. Light from a small window makes the glass of a vial glow, as if it were better traveled than it is. The cat yawns so effectively that even the stove seems persuaded to relax. You're safe here, not because nothing bad can happen, but because many small good things are organized in advance. A boy brings news that his grandmother's knee has opinions about stairs. The wise woman wraps it with a poultice that smells like the garden remembering rain. She suggests a stick cut to proper height and shows how to test it. Elbow bent, shoulders low, pride uninjured. She declines the boy's payment of 2 jokes but accepts a third. Care is a circle. Laughter counts toward the total. A traveler knocks for a charm against theft and leaves instead, with advice about locks and a request to make peace with his neighbor. If you accuse, she says, accuse the rat first, the draft second, the latch last, and the neighbor not at all until your cooler mind insists. The traveler nods, disappointed in myth, but comforted by plan. The cottage prefers plans to panic. When the lane sleeps, the healer's window keeps 1 beat of light for the hour's last delay. She writes a new list on a scrap. Visit the calf. With the wrong idea about milk, check the splint. Bless the wool for the blanket promised by harvest. The list is a lullaby with bullets rubbed off. The only point is that things will be done. Most nights end without incident, which is why you don't hear about them. But sometimes the mortar's tap echoes farther than the cottage, and a quarrel grows tall shoes. Then the lane goes from herbs to hallways, from linen to law, from mortar to clerk. Most nights were uneventful. Rare disputes reached officials. The door opens to a room that sounds like careful math. Footsteps echo off timber the way a tally stick counts debt. 1 notch, then rest. A clerk looks up, not to judge, but to remember. Law in a small town arrives on ordinary shoes and carries a pen. This hall is Modesta beam darkened by many winters, a long table that has heard more hay disputes than heroics, a chest for rolls of parchment, a seal that gives wax the authority to behave. On market days the same space sells onions and gossip. Today it will sort a handful of questions that don't belong to sacks and scales. Before we sit, a short detour through time. Earlier in the Middle Ages, some courts consulted ordeals. The hot iron carried a set pace. The cold water that either accepted you or didn't, rituals overseen with prayers and rules. We won't linger on mechanics. They were austere and formal. In 1215 a council in Rome told clergy to step away from such tests. Without a priest to bless water or iron, the practice thinned and then, in many places, stopped. Towns had to grow. New habits, words instead of heat, oaths instead of theater. Words are still serious. Sworn statements are not casual speech. They are weight placed on the scale. Two systems meet here, like neighboring fields. The older model, where neighbors testify to your reputation and congregation, backing your oath with their own end. The newer inquisitorial style, where officials ask questions, write down answers, and pursued the matter without waiting for a noisy accusation. None of it looks like a stage play. Much of it looks like men and women explaining weather, fences, fees. Listen to today's docket. A baker says a rumor harmed his trade. He names the two corners where it grew and requests a correction as much as a penalty. A tenant disputes a measure of rent barley that tried to weigh itself twice. A weaver complains about a healing fee agreed at night and regretted at noon. Someone mentions a charm muttered at a gate. The complainant wants reassurance that gates need not be involved in neighborhood quarrels. The tone is negotiator more than crusader. Who said what, where, and with what intent? The clerk asks, the quill waiting like a patient hound. Ecclesiastical and secular rooms sometimes share a street. The church court manages marriage promises, oaths broken in a way that singes souls, slander that snaps reputations, and certain cases of harmful speech or charms. The manorial or borough court tends land use, dues, breaches of the peace, and the small miracles of daily order. People move between them wearing the same cloak, asking for an outcome that lets everyone shop in the same market tomorrow. Judges and stewards prefer settlements to scenes. Take the harmful charm question. A woman is said to have used words at a neighbor's gate after a quarrel about a borrowed pot. The milk curdled, the story uncurled. The official asks for timing. When did the quarrel occur? When did the milk turn? What else happened with pails? Pasture, whether he asks for witnesses who heard the words, and for the exact words, if memory holds them. He asks if payment changed hands, if threats were made, if apology was offered and refused. The point is to sift malice from misfortune. Clerics in this century often treat whispered formulas as misguided devotion or neighborly unkindness, rather than as proof of a conspiracy against the town. Remedies lean toward penance, reconciliation, sometimes a fine that measures not fear but discourtesy. Seals press wax when a promise needs legs. The stamp comes down with a polite firmness, and someone breathes easier because a boundary is now a sentence with a period. The clerk's tally is a running hum. Names, dates, brief summaries in a margin hand that future scholars will decipher and argue about. The hall's echo keeps everyone aware of tone. Voices lower themselves and learn to fit. Penalties in these rooms have a domestic vocabulary. A person who slandered pays coin or asks forgiveness on the church porch where heir and neighbors can witness it. Someone who took payment for a cure without result may return the fee, promise to be specific about what leaves can and cannot do, and perform a public penance standing with a candle, fasting on certain days. Acts intended to mend trust, not to thrill spectators. A fence moved by accident finds its way home, escorted by many eyes and one rope. Harsher outcomes existed in law, but in this period they were uncommon here, and the records read like accounts of a household mending itself. Procedure is a kind of lullaby for nerves. The steward calls names in order, not by loudness. Oaths are taken with a hand on wood or book, the words familiar enough that lips can join even when minds are racing ahead to chores. When testimony conflicts, more neighbors are called not because truth is a popularity contest, but because in a community this size character is evidence. Who helps at harvest? Who returns tools? Who keeps the peace at ale? These questions matter if you want to know whether a muttered rhyme was meant as medicine or malice. Across Europe, forms varied. In some towns, notaries shaped a case into a tidy bundle. In some villages, the reeve's memory did the job, and parchment arrived later, if ever. But the direction of movement through these centuries is readable, away from trial by elements, toward inquiry by words, away from immediate spectacle toward slower supervision. The shift is not a revolution with banners, more a river changing course by inches that add up to a new map. The wise woman from our lane appears today, not as defendant but as explicable. The weaver's fee dispute needs a price remembered correctly. She testifies that she asked for a measure of grain and received cloth instead. The exchange was friendly. Regret arrived later like bad weather. She prefers the grain and will return the cloth at harvest. The hall exhales. The clerk writes 2 sentences that save everyone many. A seal kisses wax. Law's job here is to let neighbors go on being neighbors without a story growing teeth. Sometimes, yes, an official will warn against certain practices when panic begins to dress as policy. A priest reminds hearers of that paragraph about night rides being delusion, not geography. A steward discourages the public naming of ill wishes in market squares, not because misfortune never has causes, but because markets dislike being turned into stages for blame. The hall is where drama is carefully dismantled and returned to components, whether habit, apology, restitution. If the matter rises above the villagerily, but it happens, papers travel. A bishop's court might read them. A city magistrate might weigh them. A royal official passing through might leave a note that the king prefers peace kept and fields sown. Even then, outcomes often settle in the same register: fines, reconciliations, acts of piety performed in public so that the story ends with a better story. When the session closes, the steward reads back the promises so everyone can hear their own names wearing modest obligations. The clerk blows gently on a ribbon of ink and sets the page aside. Benches scrape in a polite chord. The hall returns to being a market in slow rehearsal. A few people linger, already previewing price and weather, glad that the town stayed one piece. Walk out with me. The door gives you back to wood smoke and the sound of a broom making peace with a threshold. Law tonight was a rope pulled hand over hand, not a drum, which makes the later legends, those crowded scenes, those shouting pamphlets, feel like visitors from another century entirely. So where do the terrifying witch hunts fit? We'll answer after a breath. When night and printing presses meet and the timeline changes temperature. The calendar on the wall is wrong. The scariest posters have been pinned to the wrong century. If you picture torches marching through a medieval lane every other week, the room clears its throat and points to a later page. Most of the famous surges, the waves of accusation you've seen painted into crowded scenes, belong to the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, not the 12th, not most of the 13th. Earlier medieval life had worries, yes, and courts, and sermons with eyebrows. But the relentless pamphlet-fed hunt you're imagining is a creature of later weather. The change has a sound, the slow creak of a printing press, the winter sigh of poor harvests, the murmuring of towns stretched by war and rumor. Put your ear to the timeline, and you can hear when the pitch rises. Walk from the village hall we left to a workshop where ink is rubbed into letters and paper waits like a patient field. A press lowers and lifts, and with each kiss of type the world learns to shout in smaller coins. Sheets, broadsides, little volumes that travel faster than careful talk. Before this, stories walked at the speed of feet. Now, sentences learn to run. Sources suggest that as the 15th century turned, cheap print began to carry sensational tales, confessions extracted elsewhere. Allegations boiled down, diagrams of evil that looked suspiciously tidy. Nuance, which does fine in porches and fails in headlines, lost a few rounds. Weather also learned a new tone. Colder years visit now and then in every age, but several stretches in the later 1400s and 1500s leaned toward stingy. Crops argued. Prices sulked upward. Cattle forgot how to be sensible. People looked for causes that felt graspable. In some regions, war knocked on doors more often. Borders flickered. Armies ate what markets couldn't spare. When a world feels pinched, explanations that gather misfortune into a story grow tempting. Scholars debate exact links, but the pattern is human. When the bread is thin, rumors are thick. Ideas changed their clothes too. Those calm earlier paragraphs, remember, the canon that called night rides a dream, didn't vanish, but other voices rose. Late medieval and early modern writers stitched together a composite picture out of older fragments. secret meetings, flights, pacts, ceremonies portrayed with more confidence than evidence, manuals for officials multiplied. Some were sober, some were stern, some were enthusiastic salesmen for alarm. The important detail for our timeline is not that one book ruled a continent. It didn't, but that a cluster of texts argued for reading misfortune through a more dramatic lens. Where the earlier counsel had been teach and correct, the later tone sometimes leaned toward seek and prosecute. Law shifted alongside paper. Procedures that had grown more inquisitorial, asking questions, taking deposition, to combine with traveling judges, centralizing states and jurisdictions eager to prove their zeal. Not everywhere, and not all at once. Europe was a patchwork quilt with mismatched squares. But if you back away a step, the overall picture shows many places taking accusations more seriously, treating the composite theory as if it were a map rather than a collage. Records from this later era use phrases that feel colder in the hand. Imagine the line on a graph you cannot see in the dark, low and bumping along through much of the high medieval period, then rising in the later 1400s, peaking a century or so after, and falling again as skeptics, lawyers, bishops, and exhausted communities began to ask better questions. Estimates for totals vary widely and are argued with care by people who enjoy footnotes. What matters here, for this calm night, is the shape of the curve and the way it refuses to match the myths about endless medieval bonfires. The big spikes live later. The medieval lane mostly kept to its chores. Gender enters the picture with nuance. In many regions, more women were accused than men, partly because suspicion tracked along social networks and household roles, but men appear to, especially in certain areas and professions. The pattern is not uniform. It is a geography of anxieties and expectations, not a single law of nature. Region mattered. Town versus countryside mattered. Who held jurisdiction mattered. The loud sentries magnified every local quirk until they looked like a rule. Closer reading brings the variety back into view and lowers the pulse. Printing made villains efficient. A pamphlet didn't need to prove much to travel, and it rarely paused to say scholars debate. It named, it sketched, it repeated. Sensational tales learned to echo each other, so that a rumor in one valley could arrive pre-dressed in another, wearing the same borrowed coat of details. At the same time, printed skepticism began to exist too. Jurists who asked for stricter standards of evidence, pastors who reminded their peers of older counsel, writers who catalogued mistakes and encouraged mercy. The press amplified both fear and doubt. Fear just sold faster. Context changed outside the page as well. Cities grew, courts layered, states competed to show moral spine. In some corners, religious conflict turned up the temperature of every conversation. In others, simple neighbor quarrels found new scripts. The result, in too many places, was an era that preferred big answers to small questions and public certainty. To quiet repair, it did not last. Waves rarely do. But while it rolled, the water was choppy. What about numbers, punishments, methods? Those belong to daylight and casebooks, and even then they need careful phrasing. Tonight we keep two outlines. Earlier medieval courts leaned toward penance, fines, reconciliations. Later systems in some regions leaned toward harsher penalties. Even there, outcomes varied. Some judges de-escalated. Some laws remained cooler. Some areas saw few trials. The take-home for your pillow is simple. The medieval night you pictured crowded with constant fear is mostly a later printout, pasted backwards on the timeline. Return to our quiet lane for a moment. Sheep still insist on being sheep. The wise woman still counts pulse and pours time. The priest still prefers teaching to theater. The steward still likes settlements you can pay in grain. That world continued, while the press in a distant town learned to hum, and pamphlets learned to travel. Some ideas from those pamphlets would drift back along the road and shift expectations. Some officials would read the new books with interest, or unease. A gradual hinge creaked. The door of an age opened wider onto anxiety. When the curve fell at last, it did so for many reasons. Skepticism learned to be fashionable again. Courts adjusted standards. War-tired communities preferred bread. 2 trials, philosophers rehearsed new ways of explaining weather and luck that didn't require a suspect. The press stopped cheering for fear quite so loudly. As abruptly as fashions change, the crowded scenes thinned. So the reveal promised earlier, the timeline most people carry in their heads, is off by a century or three. The medieval period had charms and quarrels and sermons, yes, but the roaring hunts, the standardized tropes, the confident diagrams, that was mostly later. If you keep that curve in mind, the history grows kinder and more exact. And if you're ready to meet the voices that helped set that later mood, those manuals with long titles and longer opinions, bring your candle closer. Late medieval thinkers helped set ideas. Let's meet them soon. A book can be loud without raising its voice. It smells of leather and opinions. When you open it, the candle leans in as if to hear. Late in the 15th century, a certain manual arrives on a table, beside a seal and a cup. It presents itself as practical wisdom. How to recognize wrongdoing, how to question it, how to bring order where rumor runs. Later readers will give it a famous Latin nickname, one that sounds like a hammer. Hammers are useful, but you shouldn't fix a roof with one tool alone. Even in its own day, the book was a traveler, not a throne. Turn the first leaves and you meet a combative mood. The argument is sure of its categories, sure of its chain of cause, sure of the procedures it recommends. Its authors gather earlier anxieties and stitch them into a neat diagram. Here are the signs, here the supposed methods, here the remedies. The book glides between theology, folklore, and courtroom advice, with the confidence of someone who believes. That confidence is itself evidence. Candlelight makes the margins flicker, as if the letters were warming up for a larger performance. Now look up from the page and around the room. There is another book on the shelf that tells a different kind of story. A collection of anecdotes from a preacher who liked to teach by example, cataloging oddities but also warning against credulity. Sources suggest that in this period, manuals and treatises multiplied, some anxious, some skeptical, some obsessively tidy. One may insist that nocturnal assemblies are a single plan. Another may call such tales exaggerations that need pastoral correction. The bookshelf looks like a debate, disguised as leather. The famous hammer book did not land on every desk. It was never a universal law code, never binding everywhere. In some places, officials admired its certainty. In others, they rolled their eyes, or cherry-picked a page and ignored the next. Jurists and scholars criticized its excesses. A few bishops discouraged its harsher edges. Meanwhile, local courts went on counting oaths and weighing words. You can almost hear the book knocking on doors and being told, politely, we prefer gentler tools here. Even so, the tone it helped popularize mattered. Procedures had been shifting toward written depositions and formal inquiries. A manual that treated suspicion as a system fit neatly into that drift. A steward who favored settlements might suddenly have neighbors quoting paragraphs in the market. A city judge might treat the book as a clever index, not commanding, but convenient. Where it traveled, it offered a script, and scripts, once learned, are hard to forget. A pamphlet could now summarize a theory in 2 sheets that would have taken a village 3 winters to invent on its own. Listen to a reading circle in a chapter house. The reader's finger moves down a list of signs, while another monk gently coughs at each leap from story to doctrine. Someone asks, "Isn't this too tidy?" Another replies that tidiness is a virtue when the world feels messy. Then a third voice reminds the room of older counsel. We were told to teach, not to panic. The candle hisses when a bit of wick charcoal is pinched away. For a moment, the flame steadies, and the debate looks almost like calm. The famous manual prefers certainty. Life prefers variety. In one town, a magistrate cites it and grows stern. In another, a clerk calls for better evidence. In a third, a pastor quotes the earlier paragraph about night rides being delusions and keeps his parish from turning rumor into policy. Region matters, custom matters. Even within the same city, one generation reads with appetite, the next with caution. That's the trouble with books that promise maps. They tempt people to stop asking directions from neighbors. Watch the page turn. Procedure chapters lay out questions to ask and signs to heed. Some advice is simply common sense dressed in robes. Separate witnesses, keep records, avoid leading questions. Other advice boosts confidence when confidence is what you ought to question. The book is eloquent about malice and thin on ordinary motives. It speaks often of enemies and seldom of fences, pales, and weather. A good judge, even while reading, keeps an eye on the door that leads back to the market, where most disputes begin and end. Not all manuals agreed with the hammer. Some urged patience, attributed strange happenings to illness, dream, or mischief, and recommended focusing on proven harms rather than invisible counsels. Sources suggest that legal humanist students of cleaner procedure and sharper standards began to whisper that evidence deserved a higher chair. Pastors wrote quiet correctives, reminding readers of the difference between spiritual theater and pastoral care. The bookshelf grew crowded and contradictory, which is to say, alive. The book's fame in later centuries partly comes from its theatrics, its bold claims, its parade of examples, its confidence in a grand pattern. But fame is not the same as rule. Even where it traveled, it sat among many voices. Some officials adopted its tone and regretted it later. Some treated it as a cautionary tale the moment they closed it. The most honest way to picture its life is as a strong wind that sometimes filled sails and sometimes blew out candles. Now return to our lane. The wise woman's window glows. The priest's door stands half open. The steward counts geese as they become rent. A copy of the manual might sit in a chest in the next town over, consulted when a case grows thorny. It might be quoted, abbreviated, misremembered, but the lane is still governed by character and fields and the appeal of tomorrow's market. Manuals cast long shadows, mostly in rooms, already lit for drama. If you hold the manual in both hands and simply listen to the leather creak, you can hear what books do best and worst. They preserve arguments. They also lend them authority they don't always merit. They carry knowledge. They also carry mood. When a text with a hammer's title arrives in an era that loves tidy diagrams, you get more diagrams. When readers recover their appetite for ambiguity, the hammer learns to stay on the bench unless there's a nail that truly needs it. Close the covers. The candle sighs. You feel, perhaps, what many felt then: relief at having a guide, unease at trusting any guide too much. The book will travel, so will its critics, so will better procedures, but while pages argue past midnight, the town still needs someone to find a lost brooch, calm a worried heart, mark a boundary in the snow, and bless a voyage that leaves at dawn. Manuals talk about wrongdoers as a category. People live next door, and their troubles are specific. A book can be loud without raising its voice. It can also be wrong in places without being useless. Knowing that is part of what makes a village wise. The leather darkens as you set it aside. Outside, the lane is consulting a different expert one, with chalk and a pouch, and a habit of making neighbors breathe easier. Meanwhile, everyday service magicians kept working. A chalk mark knows your name before you say it. A coin changes pockets and decides it will behave. A whisper turns out to be a timetable, not a curse. Come back after sunset. Bring the ribbon from the cap you wore when you last felt lucky, and a calm heart. If you came here expecting thunder, you will be disappointed and relieved. The door clicks, the lamp remembers its job, and the room arranges itself around practical hope. On market days the expert works in the open, under a canvas that flaps like a patient hand. Other days, there's a corner room with shelves that look more like a scholar's pantry than a lair, pouches labeled for nettle and betony, a bit of chalk wrapped in linen, a smooth bowl that holds water and reflections, a scrap of parchment with a psalm number. People call them cunning man here, wise woman there, service magician, in a chronicle that liked tidy phrases. The sign says simply help with lost things, worries, hearts, and thieves. It is both advertisement and index to the town's fragile categories. You sit and describe a brooch. The expert listens the way a tailor measures, mind taking neat hems around your facts. For thieves, they might offer a ritual that is mostly a stern letter to the neighborhood, a name folded into wax, a key balanced on a glass, a prayer spoken aloud so anyone guilty within earshot feels their own conscience doing the work. For lost animals or souring milk or sleep that won't stay, there is usually a blessing that also teaches patience. Sprinkle this. Say that. Move the bucket to the east wall where the draft won't play jokes. For matters of affection, the language grows euphemistic and courteous. Signs to read, tokens to exchange, the sort of guidance that lets people behave kindly while calling it destiny. Sources suggest communities often tolerated such services when results felt benign and pride was kept to a whisper. Methods look theatrical until you notice how much of the theater is simply focus. Chalk circles tidy the mind. A sieve and shears, trick that later writers love to mention, becomes, in person, a way of letting questions stand still long enough to be answered. The bowl of water is a mirror that prefers honesty. The psalm on the scrap is a short route to steadier breathing. Sometimes a countercharm is offered to undo what was done, which usually means repairing a quarrel with civility and a loaf. The expert does have a little book, yes, part prayer, part recipes, part local weather wisdom, and a pocket almanac that knows when the moon will sit politely. A coin clinks, a pouch rustles. Hope remembers how to walk. Attitudes vary and keep their voices low. A priest might nod at blessings that point hearts upward and frown at formulas treated like levers. The village steward prefers that fees be sensible and promises practical. The expert learns to speak in disclaimers. This comforts, that counsels, the rest belongs to patience. They are careful with claims. They do not sell storms. When the priest passes, they lift the cap. When a child watches, they make the chalk into a flower and explain that flowers do the real work of making rooms kinder. Watch a case. The brooch is not simply lost. It is entangled in a day when tempers frayed and a basket overturned. The expert draws the shape of your lane, asks who you greeted, and when you last felt the weight at your collar. They place the bowl on the table, not because water will volunteer a map, but because reflection teaches the mind to see what it forgot. Go home by the well, they say finally, and check the peg by the door where you never hang anything. If it isn't there, look in the apron you lent. You go, and it is there. Gratitude pays for half the magic. A coin pays for the rest. Another day the question is a heart with too many opinions. 2 hazelnuts are named and set on the hearth. The expert says if they roll together, kindness will have an easy job, and if they roll apart, kindness will need friends. They do both, because hazelnuts are as complicated as people. The advice that follows is factual dressed as fate. Speak plainly, keep appointments, avoid grand gestures near harvest. Wear blue if blue helps you feel truthful. You laugh, feel steadier, and decide to be braver in a way the stars would endorse, even if stars never replied. Ethics matter here. A charmer who charges cruel prices will soon work alone. A boastful one learns how quickly a lane can empty. When results feel benign, doors stay open. When tricks cross into spite, the steward hears about it. Sources suggest prosecutions could happen if harm was claimed, or healing fees smelled like coercion. More often, officials nudged tone back toward gentleness. Many times, the cunning person served as witness rather than target. I counseled. Civility, they say, and half the room nods, because they were there for the civility and the loaf. Not all cases are tidy. A missing cow refuses to learn the lesson, and the expert recommends what prudent people would anyway. Talk to the neighbor whose fence tilts. Know the paths at dusk. Understand your own habit of forgetting a gate. A suspected thief returns a purse anonymously after a public ritual that was really a sermon about conscience disguised as chalk. A sleepless child rests when someone moves the bed away from the draft, and adds a verse that the mother sings, because singing makes breath orderly. None of this is sorcery in the loud sense. All of it is sorcery in the sense that community is a spell we cast with stubborn kindness. There are failures, the expert says so. The bowl stays blank. The key refuses to tremble on the parchment. The signs speak in riddles, and then in silence. On such days the room practices humility. Try the reeve, the expert says. Try the wise woman with a better ear for coughs. They hand back the coin or fold it into a pouch that buys candles for the church. Reputation mends itself because honesty is the strongest charm in stock. If you listen long enough, you hear the sky knocking at the door. The expert times certain workings by the moon, glances at an almanac before advising on a journey, and speaks of good days the way gardeners do. Sometimes a traveler mentions a city practitioner with tables of the heavens and an instrument that turns angles into answers. The room brightens. Curious. Chalk is local. Stars are continental. People who help in lanes begin to wonder what the scholars do on rooftops with brass and numbers. Scholars looked upward 2 stars, and calculations are waiting just beyond. This door. An instrument catches starlight and turns it into numbers. A circle of brass slides. The sky answers with a click. Someone on a rooftop whispers to the horizon, and the horizon, being polite, leans closer. Astrology in these centuries is not a cape. It is calendar and clinic. A university physician keeps a small table of the heavens beside his jar of dried rose and fennel. He notes which sign visits the moon tonight, not to command fate, but to choose gentle timing. Sources suggest that many treatments were scheduled by the sky's clock. Bleeding avoided when the moon stood near the part of the body pictured in a helpful diagram. Purges delayed until a cooler hour. Journeys advised for days when the planets seemed to promise smooth company. The famous zodiac man, drawn in manuscripts, points with labeled limbs. He is not a tyrant but a guide for nervous hands. Tools are calm. The astrolabe fits your palm yet holds the world. Plates nest like biscuits. A rule turns. Angles, bow. A student learns to lift star to number a number 2 hour, then carries that hour down into the ward, where patients wait with their own weather. A master checks tables copied from scholars writing in Arabic, and Latin Lido's careful calculators. Paris's solid lists sand the page rustles with gratitude for translators who ferried wisdom across languages. The discipline calls itself astronomia when it measures, and astrologia when it interprets. The line is thin and argued over wine. Still, the night sky remains a respectable colleague. Even cautious clerics bless it as part of creation's math. Debate lives next door. A theologian writes that stars incline but do not compel. Another worries that people love excuses more than remedies. A preacher warns against blaming Mars for a temper that bread and patience would manage. A jurist, practical as a broom, insists that courts weigh deeds, not constellations. And yet on a mild evening, the same jurist checks the moon before a long trip, because judging others is one thing and choosing your own weather is another. Humans are like that. The universities, for their part, love a distinction. Natural influences allowed, fortune-telling forbidden, calendar use praised, fatalism scolded. The lecture ends with a smile that says, "Be devout, be curious, be reasonable." Alchemy hums downstairs. The laboratory looks like a kitchen that read philosophy. A small furnace keeps a steady temper, hotter than stew but cooler than panic. Glass bulbs pout, copper vessels bloom a quiet green. A coil of tubing promises patience. The work is patient too. Calcine, dissolve, distill, coagulate verbs, as slow as winter bread. Some alchemists seek a medicine to brighten bodies, a quintessence, pulled from plants or wine. Some wonder about metals and whether base ones can be educated into nobility. Some simply find joy in watching matter declare its manners. They write in riddles both to protect recipes and to delight friends. The green lion eats the sun. The king marries the red queen. The eagle flies 7 times. If you strip away the drama, you find handcraft and hope. Ovens need stoking. Glass needs washing. Failure needs tea. Granite minds stand by with raised eyebrows. Do not promise what you cannot deliver, says the tidy scribe. Purify yourself at least as much as the copper, says the monk who reads both scripture and stovetop. A bishop praises the study of nature as praise of its maker, then asks experimenters to skip the boasting and the shortcuts. A city council gently reminds that counterfeit coin is still counterfeit, even if made with a philosophical story. Meanwhile, the quiet majority of alchemists keep their benches clean, their notebooks legible, and their claims modest in public. Many write recipes for soaps, inks, pigments, and conserves that households will actually use. The furnace, when treated as teacher, is patient. Natural magic arrives as a phrase and carefully sets down its bag. It doesn't mean stage tricks. It points to properties thought to live in herbs, stones, and magnets, virtues, folded into the world by its maker, discoverable by experiment and respectful borrowing from older books. A scholar strings a lodestone and watches iron obey. No demon is needed, only curiosity and a good knot. Another collects stories, a ring that warms when danger nears perhaps, because silver knows about sweat. A herb that cools a brow, because Mint is mint, a mirror that makes small letters large because glass is kind when shaped. The claim is gently radical. Some marvels are natural once you learn their grammar. Not every wonder implies an oath at midnight. Theologians nod when the tone is devout and hedge when it strays into petitions that sound like bargaining. Universities are chorus and argument both. A friar with ink on his sleeve tests lenses by bouncing sunlight on a wall, then writes about rainbows as if they were sermons painted by light. A master of medicine copies a chapter on urine colors with more care than he gives to royal news. A student, not yet jaded, watches a magnet pull a needle and feels the good shiver that means the world is wider than last week. Across the courtyard, a preacher practices a homily, warning students not to confuse the clock with the hours, the instrument with wisdom. The students nod and then meet the clockmaker anyway, because ticking is persuasive. Paper makes the tours. Larger tables of planetary motion travel folded in saddlebags, smudged at the corners where rain once intruded. A physician in a market town consults them by candle and sets a bone on a day recommended for patients. An apothecary times a distillation by the clock and by the sky, then labels the jar with 2 dates because both feel true. Skeptics keep their pens ready. If the medicine works, they praise the recipe and ignore the horoscope. If it fails, they scold the horoscope and pocket the recipe for another time. History is full of such negotiations. You ask about forbidden books, about ritual circles and summons. They existed in lists and in some locked chests. Clergy wrote stern pages against necromancy and its cousins. But here we keep the camera on. Public rooms, the clinic, the lecture hall, the shop. In these, most ambition wears an apron. The grand claims that later pamphlets repeat like drumbeats, those belong to a louder age or to quieter corners. For our medieval chapter, the picture is steadier. Curiosity under rules, charts under lamps, experiments with lids. There is humor. Even here, a student predicting the day's luck is told to sweep the hall and discover that cleanliness improves. Every sign master insists the stars favor humility and then assigns an essay to prove it. A young alchemist learns the single most important technique, how not to scorch the only table the friary possesses. A senior physician admits he checks the weather by his knee before consulting his astrolabe, and everyone nods because bodies are still the oldest instruments. Night folds in. The rooftop observer resets the rule on the astrolabe and feels the sky breathe like a neighbor on the other side of a thin wall. The furnace cools until it pings like distant hail. The lecture ends with a benediction disguised as a footnote. Remember that knowledge is a lamp, not a verdict. As we climb down the stair, a different kind of picture waits at the bottom. One not drawn by tables, but by painters and printers who love symbols more than footnotes. And the pictures, where did broomsticks and cats come from? The lane's doors are closing, the hearths are honest, and the next room hangs its images where the eye can find them. A broom is just a broom until a picture needs a story. A cat is only a cat until a margin doodle asks for company. A cooking pot holds stew, then suddenly, in a pamphlet, it holds the mood of an entire century. If you feel your shoulders rise at these symbols, let's set them down on the table where they began, in a kitchen that wants dinner on time, and a floor that prefers honesty. Start with the broom. It is the household's second spine rush, birch, or heather bound to a stick, hung by the door, respected like a tool that knows more of a house than any neighbor. Sources suggest that in different places brooms picked up meanings beyond sweeping, threshold customs, blessings for a new home, a playful leap at festivities to mark a beginning. Later readers would embroider these gestures into grander tales, but the raw material stayed domestic. A handle within reach, bristles that remind the room to be tidy, a pole that stands where drafts tame themselves. Now the leap from floor to sky. Pictures are persuasive. Late medieval and early modern artists loved allegory and satire. A broom in a woman's hand could mean household, work, independence, or when a woodcut wanted a wink, mischief. When prints began to standardize the look of wrongdoing, the broom came along because it was already a shorthand for woman at home, and because pictures like contrasts everyday object, imagined night. A person straddling a broom in ink owes as much to visual joke and carnival play as to testimony. The lane, meanwhile, kept sweeping. Cats enter by the practical door. Medieval towns and farms collected grain. Grain collects mice. Mice collect cats. A cat on a sill is a contract you can hear in purrs. I hunt, you feed. We share the sunspot. In manuscripts, cats appear under scribes' desks, for reasons anyone who has ever spilled ink can guess. Saints' lives include friendly animals. Bestiaries include moral lessons that make cats sly when writers need a point. Later fear literature will recruit cats as sidekicks to villains. In kitchens they remain what they always were: clever, tidy, and very good at their job. Where did the darker link come from? In the centuries when accusations grew louder, theorists of evil liked lists. They added animal helpers to their diagrams, calling them familiars or spirits. Pamphlets drew cats, toads, and birds as if they were colleagues in wrongdoing. It made for vivid woodcuts and easy shorthand. But a woodcut is not a census. Many households kept cats without drama. Many parish records talk about grain, not whiskers. The cat's reputation moves with the pen more than with the paw, and the pot, the famous cauldron, stand in a working kitchen and count its jobs: soups, dyes, soap, beer, water for washing, a glue made from hooves, a dye made from plants, a stew that forgives delay. The pot is a civil servant. It hangs on a hook that lifts and lowers like a sensible moon. When artists sought to picture secret meetings, they raided the kitchen for props, because props tell stories quickly. A pot with steam means work happening, ingredients changing, and that is enough for the image to borrow. In the pamphlet, it becomes a theater. In the cottage, it becomes supper. Why do these three objects, broom, cat, cauldron, stick so well to the later idea of a witch? Because symbols love edges where categories touch. Household meets rumor. Women's labor meets male commentary. Every day meets festival. A broom is public and private. A cat belongs to both household and wilderness. A pot holds both food and color for cloth. They make tidy anchors for pictures that want to sell, but none of them were born guilty. They were born indispensable. Consider festival time. In several regions, people paraded with masks, flipped roles, made jokes that let a community exhale. A broom became a baton of play. A pot became a drum. Firelight made silhouettes long, and laughter made them longer. Later, when pamphlets needed villains, festival's vocabulary was recycled with a frown. Scholars debate which customs fed which images. What's certain is that pictures often traveled farther than the gentle scenes they exaggerated, and the exaggeration found eyes hungry for crisp lines between good and bad. The brooms are the story about fields and fruitfulness, delicate phrasing. Some rites blessed land with gestures that looked like sweeping. Some wedding customs used brooms as gates to hop, a playful promise of new household order. These acts were local, mild, and two participants, mostly jokes with a tidy edge of hope. Later writers, eager for spice, retrofitted them with meanings they did not originally bear. The safest rule at bedtime: if a rite sounds loud, it probably grew louder on paper. Images work like seeds. They sprout copies. A woodcut in one city is inked and rinked, until the broom in its frame looks inevitable. Printers learn which compositions sell, and fear is a dependable customer. Cats perch on hat brims, pots bubble on cue. Skies fill with silhouettes, because blank skies are poor salesmen. Meanwhile, in real lanes, someone ties a badge to a bed, mutters a psalm over broth, and steps carefully over the broom, because the floor is still damp. This flattening of symbols into stereotypes encouraged some viewers to scan their neighbors. With picture frames in mind: a cat on a sill, note it; a bundle of herbs by a door, note that too; a broom hung crosswise after mopping, make it a sign. And yet, even amid such readiness to see what pamphlets taught, many officials insisted on actual harms. Courts asked about payments, quarrels, reputations, and pails before believing pictures. There is comfort in that. Paper is persuasive. Habits, more so. If this chapter has a small smile in it, it's because household truth is stubborn. You can load a broom with legend and it still sweeps. You can write essays about cats, and they will still choose the lap that denies them. You can paint a pot into a silhouette of dread, and it will still boil beans. Symbols drift, chores remain. That's not a disappointment. It's a lullaby. Our pictures are calmer now. A broom stands by the door. A cat, insulted by mere metaphor, patrols under the bench and reminds mice that images do not hunt. The pot hums a low working note. Outside, the weather thinks about which path to take. Inside, people make sense of luck with tools, talk, and dinner. But who got a why when panic rose? The answer rarely lived in the kitchen. It lived next door, where neighbors argued, clouds misbehaved, and a cow had a bad week. The hail came like spilled barley, fast and oddly beautiful. Everyone watched it flatten the cabbage, and told the same joke about soup becoming easier to chew. Later, after the sky apologized with a rainbow that was trying too hard, the milk failed to butter, and a cow chose a bad morning to cough. None of this meant anything more than weather, until a quarrel remembered itself. A gate had stuck. A passerby had offered advice, with the tone of ownership. A sentence had landed wrong. Then a look, then a mutter. May your tools remember their age. The phrase is nothing, a local shrug. But when the churn refused to cooperate, it attached itself like a burr. She said a thing, someone told someone, and now the butter thinks. Rumor does not run. It strolls in comfortable shoes. It begins with concern, becomes explanation, and ends as entertainment that nobody admits they paid for. It gathers details the way a child gathers pebbles, pocketing 3 smooth ones, and leaving 7 behind. The weather, which started all this, is demoted. The cow's mood is ignored. The gate has forgotten it was ever stuck. A name remains. The lane rehearses the story until it fits a melody everyone can hum. Neighbors do not wake up villains. They wake up human, tired, jealous for a moment, proud of their fence line, protective of their cheese. Accusations sprout where those ordinary weeds grow thick. A widow with few allies and an excellent tongue. A man who collects small debts like hobbies. A household whose piglets always thrive, which is suspicious only on hungry days. Later pamphlets will draw horns. The lane draws little arrows between bad weeks and sharp words. The mechanics are quiet. Butter refuses to set, so the churn is turned and turned until arms admire themselves. Someone says a charm backwards, because someone remembered it that way, and the experiment becomes part of the story. A child falls and the bruise blooms like a dramatic flower. The bruise's shape is described to 3 people, and grows an eye in the retelling. A cow wanders through a hole in the fence, eats the neighbor's beet tops, and returns wearing the title Bewitched, because it keeps the blame at a tidy distance from the fence mender. Officials, when they are sensible, begin where we began. Weather, pails, drafts, fences. They ask whether milk turned last week too, whether the maid learned the churn's rhythm, whether the cow's cough matches the season's habit. They listen for money was a fee contested, and for pride, who felt shown up. They test the story for contradictions that arrive when 3 mouths swear the same sentence but in different keys. They weigh reputation, who helps at harvest, who returns tools on time. An oath does not fix butter, but it does fix some stories. Gender patterns appear, then misbehave. Many regions accused more women than men, and you can draw lines from that. 2 household roles, to the visibility of women's work, to the fact that caretaking jobs put you near misfortune when misfortune needs a face. Men, however, enter the records too. Shepherds called weather whisperers, healers accused after fees soured, millers whose tolls felt like conjuring when grain vanished into gears. Region matters. In some places, men filled most of the lists. In others, women did. The picture refuses to become a rule. It insists on being a map. Money does not cause rumor, but it gives rumor good boots. A rent dispute echoes through 3 alleys and finds a quarrel ready to be its chorus. 2 families compete for the same customer. One's bread fails, the other's oven shines. The explanation that requires the least apology wins. A gift refused at a christening becomes a proverb the next day. A lawsuit about a boundary stone reads like weather until someone adds a charged word to the margin. Then everything becomes weather with eyebrows. Cunning folk are double-edged in such landscapes. When peace holds, they are repair kits with faces. When peace fails, their chalk looks like an accusation waiting to be misread. Some are hauled in to explain themselves, and they do. I blessed, I advised patience, I told him to patch the fence. Others boast unwisely, and learn how quickly a morning knot can become an afternoon rope. Many keep their heads down and their work plain. The lane appreciates modesty when thunder is still rehearsing. There is, too, the problem of coincidence. Wearing costume, someone mutters in anger, and a hen dies the next day, because hens sometimes do that. The mutter and the death acquire marriage in the minutes between markets. Once married, they reproduce. Cousins of the story appear everywhere. Officials, parish or secular, who have copied that older paragraph about night rides being delusions, also learn to copy a quieter practice, unmatching events that neighbors matched too eagerly. Slander cases, which are surprisingly cozy as lawsuits go, show up like little brooms. One person names another ill-wisher in a lane. The named person objects. The church porch becomes a stage for an apology spoken with a hand on a book, or a fine that tastes like embarrassment and repairs a reputation in full view of beeswax and stone. These procedures are not drama, they are janitorial. They sweep rumor back into dust, pin blame on the safer board of unkind speech, and let butter be butter again. Scarcity changes every recipe. In a lean year, the same old quarrel wears teeth. Community that would normally nod at the wise woman's basket and the priest's blessing begins to group suspicions into patterns. It keeps happening, people say, and forget that bad harvests come in sets and that rumor, once paid, expects interest. Officials either hold the line, show me deeds, show me pails, show me weather, or step onto a slope that later pamphlets. Greece, it matters a great deal which choice a town makes, and it varies more than legends admit. Sometimes courage looks like questions. A reeve says, "Have you tried moving the churn?" A priest says, "We prayed first. Now we apologize for words, and see if the cow forgives us." A neighbor says, "I will sit with you until the butter turns, because alms are better in company." The solution arrives, as many do, disguised as patience and neighborliness. You're safe here. The lane hums, not because it can guarantee outcomes, but because it can guarantee hands. We should confess the other cases, the ones where nerves fray into formal accusation, where an official quotes a stern manual instead of a gentle parish book, where a household's awkwardness becomes evidence for a theory that flatters fear. Those belong partly to later centuries, and partly to certain regions even now in our story. They differ by law book, by custom, by the temper of one judge, on one winter. Across Europe, results differed more than legends admit. The next room opens onto that patchwork, penalties, procedures, and outcomes that prove there was never just one story. There isn't one map. There are many small maps, overlapped like leaves. If a pamphlet says Europe, the records reply, which parish, which judge, which winter. The town square hushes, a quill settles, a distant bell chooses the hour. History clears its throat and replaces the megaphone with a stack of ledgers. Begin in places that liked parchment to be tidy, in parts of the German-speaking lands, and in Switzerland, certain courts in the later loud centuries treated the composite theory as if it were a blueprint. When they convicted, harsher penalties followed, fire spoken of with official gravity and little else. The words in the record are remarkably plain: names, charges, depositions, sentence. They are not stage directions, they are formula inked by clerks who preferred order to spectacle, even when the outcome was severe. Step across the channel, and the picture shifts. In England and Wales, for a felony conviction the customary end was hanging, not burning, and many accused never reached that end at all. Juries hesitated, judges asked narrow, practical questions. What deed? What harm? Who saw what? Precisely. The language of indictments sounds like careful carpentry fitting, join to join, leaving no gap for rumor to squeeze through. Some cases closed with acquittal, some with lesser penalties, some with a silence that says the town remembered it had plows to sharpen, a square that looks the same as any other, a bell that rings the same note, yields a different line in the ledger, because law and habit taught it to turn north and time shift a little, and you find Nordic countries with patterns that don't copy the pamphlet's diagram. Waves arriving later or gentler, local law shaping outcomes more than the traveling stories did. Sources suggest regional councils sometimes cooled proceedings. A high court might overturn a local zeal, move west to the Low Countries in certain French jurisdictions, and you meet appellate courts that acted like lids, parliaments reviewing, trimming, or voiding sentences, demanding stronger proof, reminding lower benches that fear is not evidence. In Spain, the famed inquisitorial machinery, whatever else it did, often proved skeptical of the composite theory. Officials asked for demonstration, not diagram, and many local storms rained out before reaching the capital's files. None of this turns the era into a lullaby. It does turn the map into a patchwork quilt, where some squares are quieter. Procedure matters almost as much as belief. Regions under Roman law, influence leaned into written dossiers, depositions, and inquiry driven by an official. Common law islands leaned more on juries, presentments, and the sturdy stubbornness of neighbors under oath. Each system had valves for pressure, confession rules, standards for witnesses, paths for appeal. Where those valves held firm, panic looked for another village. Where they stuck, pamphlets found customers. Even the phrasing of oaths changed the air. Swear by God and your daily bread in one street, by saints and civic peace in another, and you will steer stories toward different harbors. Not all outcomes wore severity. Many cases from the medieval centuries, and still a fair number in the louder age, resolved as housekeeping, penance on market day, fines that mended words more than wallets, reconciliations witnessed on the church porch so neighbors could resume being neighbors, records note suspicion dismissed for lack of proof, fees restored, apology made. A clerk loved such lines. They made the shelf lighter. Some judges learned to de-escalate as a craft. They wrote questions that left rumor gasping for breath. They redirected quarrels to the older categories Landerand. Let butter return to being butter. Numbers, tempting as they are at bedtime, refuse to behave without footnotes. Estimates vary. Tallies depend on which archives survived and which didn't. What we can say gently is that many places saw few trials, a handful saw many, and even in those, the curve bent down, as skepticism became fashionable again. You can trace that bend, lawyers frowning at bad evidence, bishops repeating earlier counsel to teach rather than panic, officials preferring bread shipments to court days during weary wars. When the curve fell, it did so in 100 local ways. A judge who required 2 witnesses where one used to do. A town that started writing down procedures instead of improvising. A printer who discovered that ballads sold better than fear. Language in records will surprise you. It reads like rain. On ledgers, steady, unpoetic, necessary. Item, the accused did, asked. She answered, because proof was insufficient. No thunder, only verbs. This does not lessen the stakes, it does change the texture. Later pictures taught us to hear drums. The files mostly offered chairs, tables, and a clerk with a sandshaker, drying ink. Even in severe moments, the square often remained more administrative than cinematic. It is strange comfort to know the paper did not shout dot, and yet, variety cuts both ways. Some towns treated the manual with too much respect. Some sheriffs counted severity as a badge. Some preachers sharpened their rhetoric, until neighbors felt nicked by it. The same century could host a skeptical judge and a credulous one 50 miles apart. The same province might ease one year and harden the next. Climate, war, harvest, leadership, printing age, tugged at the rope. That's why the kindest sentence we can offer is the truest. There was never just one story. Picture a map again, but draw it as weather. Here, a squall of cases. There, blue sky and ordinary days. Beyond, a front that threatens and dissolves at a border of good procedure. The bell that marks hours also marks moods. It invites markets, summons courts, calls to worship, and, when used well, gives fear a schedule it cannot control. Many communities learned, slowly and with backsteps, to prefer schedules to spectacles. What matters for sleep is this: you can lower your shoulders. The medieval world in these chapters looked far more like lanes negotiating chores than bonfires every fortnight. The later hunts were real and harsh in places. They were also patchy, argued, restrained here, encouraged there. And finally, in many regions, curtailed by the same tools that once amplified them: pens, pulpits, benches, bells. If you hold to that patchwork, stories grow human again. The quill rests, the square exhales. A magistrate ties a ribbon round a roll and puts it away. Somewhere beyond this parish, other traditions cloak harm and help in words that don't translate neatly. Their stories deserve their own careful room, without export of our categories or our pictures. The lane dims. Lamps trim their flames. Beyond Europe, different traditions deserve respect, and we will step toward them softly. A word can cross an ocean and come home wearing the wrong shoes. Which tries this trip and finds a polite guard at every border. The guard stamps the passport and says, gently, we don't have that category here. What many places did have were other words, for blessing, for harm, for the expert you called when luck forgot your address. The river at dusk keeps its own counsel. The drum is soft. A thread of incense persuades the air to agree. Downriver in cities that lit lamps with sesame oil, scholars wrote calmly about harmful acts and helpful recitations, weighing intent and result. A healer traces a verse with a finger and breathes. Steadier, a jurist writes that petitioning the merciful for aid is devotion, while bargaining with shadows is not. Sources suggest terms like seer and ruchya lived inside legal and spiritual discussions with many shelves. The shelves did not match Europe's. They didn't need to. People still wanted their children to sleep, their crops to remember rain, their travels to end at a door that opened further east, in courtyards that smell of turmeric and wood smoke. A grandmother ties a black thread on a wrist to distract an envious glance. No one says the English word. They say Nazar, or a local cousin, and shrug the way people do when they are sure of custom. An astrologer sets up under a tree and recommends a day for a journey, then reminds the client to pack water and humility. Scholars debate periods and texts, but most households do not. They keep to habit and neighborly advice. The drumbeat here is the same tempo as everywhere. Care, then care again. Climb by ink to a capital where a court astronomer keeps precise tables and a doctor listens to a pulse with the patience of a gardener. Some calendar diviners choose lucky directions and unlucky ones with a brush, painting down a kindness that keeps travelers from rushing. In a temple, a priest writes a character on yellow paper and burns it, mixing ashes with water, as if turning hope into drinkable form. A careful thinker nearby frowns at excess, praises moderation, and prefers medicine that admits when it needs help. Labels differ. The feeling of tidy caution does not. On an island where seasons keep a clean ledger, a court diviner considers days the way a baker considers ovens. South and west are not just compass points, they are moods. A priest of an older tradition knots paper into shapes that persuade a household to breathe easier. A monk of a newer one rings a bell that schedules mercy. The two sounds meet over a bridge and decide to share the air. Words do not fuse. Lives overlap without panic. If a child asks what to call any of it, the answer is usually the name of the ritual itself, not a category that gathers strangers. Across a desert that flowers without asking permission, a scholar copies a verse with a reed pen. A leather wallet is stitched to carry small lines of scripture, folded not as a lever but as a reminder. A traveling poet sings histories at dusk near a well and adds a proverb that makes the water taste like courage. Avoid envy, the proverb says, and the crowd nods because envy tastes the same in many languages. Harm is recognized. Remedies are social before they are spectacular. Strong tea is poured. A neighbor sits closer. Northwest again, in a town that remembers caravans and sea wind. A charm might be sewn into a seam the way a kind secret is kept between friends. A judge weighs cases with a preference for proof over diagram. A preacher tells a story that keeps a bold line between devotion and pretending to order the cosmos like a servant. The incense here is clove sweet, but it does not change the principle. Institutions argue. Households keep gentle list spread, broth, blessing, apology. Cross oceans in your head without getting seasick. In the Americas before print learned to shout there, complex worlds were in place. Ritual specialists, calendars that tuned agriculture to sky, ceremonies that braided people to land. Those words for power and its limits do not map onto our European boxes. A careful reader leaves the boxes at the dock. Later centuries made painful tangles of all this, but our purpose tonight is shrugged in respect. Many peoples had names for help and harm that sit in their own grammars. We listen without renaming. Return to the river at dusk. A woman empties a bowl of grain into another and says a line that makes the work smooth. Would every theologian approve? Probably not. Does the bowl care? Not at all. The line's job is not to tilt stars. It is to keep wrists from becoming little engines of panic. Even the strictest traditions usually made room for that. Teach intention, warn against commerce with malice, and accept customs that are really breath control wearing jewelry. What we keep seeing are guardrails, not billboards. Many traditions, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, others wrote cautions against using sacred words as if they were buttons. They distinguished prayer from purchase, blessing from bargaining, care from control. Between the lines, you hear a familiar voice. Be devout. Be kind. Don't outsource responsibility for your fence. Manuals and sermons changed tone with centuries, but the best neighbors everywhere kept choosing the fence and harm. Those stories exist in every culture too, and they deserve daylight in courts, not fables. Some called it malefice, some sorcery, some envy, some the old possibility of someone willing ill. The wise reply was also shared. Define harm narrowly, prove it carefully, refuse to hunt simply to feel powerful. Where those replies held, communities kept their shape. Where they failed, pamphlets or their local equivalents sold well. So when we say witchcraft and imagine Europe's later pictures, it is worth pausing and letting other worlds keep their own names. The impulse underneath hope and worry with home shoes and is universal. The wrappers differ, and the differences matter. History is a shy guest. It loosens its scarf when we stop insisting it borrow ours. The drum fades, the incense into the night. The river keeps its private conversation with the moon. Far away and near at once, lanes lock their doors with different latches and the same sigh. We've looked outward with respect. Now the camera turns back toward our small town, where months have been waiting politely, calendars stacked like folded linens. Back in our village, the year keeps turning, and with it the quiet rites that made nights feel brave. The year is a ring you can hold in your hands. It smells like smoke and evergreen. It clicks at the door latch, not just at the church bell. If you want to know the month, touch a threshold. The wood will say, walk forward from winter with a coal carried in a pan. It is not a wildfire. It is a domestic one, promoted for travel. Neighbors lift theirs to meet yours and make a shared start of it. In some places the first day is counted by church, in others by field. Most count by both. Candles move through lanes, the wax softens, the air sweetens, and doorways receive the little light, like a sentence ending in a hopeful period. People say words they learned from grandparents, and sometimes from the priest. And nobody argues about grammar, because the point is breath in unison. Scholars debate which rite came first. Households care that the flame behaves and the bread rises. When land wakes, feet follow. The parish walks its edges in a week, with a good name crosses cut in bark. Songs learned when the mouth was young. A blessing offered to the ditch that gathers rain with more patience than glamour. This is not spectacle. It is administration, done outdoors. Boundary stones greeted so they remember. Weeds noted so they don't make jokes in June. Children carry switches they are allowed to tap politely on boots and gates. A sort of custody shared between laughter and law. At the end there is soup that remembers bones and herbs that remember last summer's hill. May arrives with a habit of pretending it hasn't, then suddenly becoming bright. Some towns stand a pole for dancing. The pole is a tree in a narrow suit. Others fasten twigs over lintels, or bring home a branch with the confidence of someone who knows where green comes from. Meanings meet and combine like rivers, old a custom, new a blessing, and the convenience of any excuse to tidy the lane and greet the sun. If a song blushes in one verse, the elders cough and let it pass. Most lines are about rain doing the right thing and neighbors attending to joy on time. There are bonfires in several months with different names and similar hearts. Summer's height invites high places to answer the sky in its own language. People climb, pile brush, set alight, and watch the hill speak in flames that are not angry, only tall. Herds are counted there because counting near fire feels accurate. Lovers are noticed there because faces near fire look honest. A wheel might be rolled, safely and with supervision, to describe the year's curve. The church frowns only when the fire forgets to be a prayer. Otherwise a blessing arrives like a lid that fits. The priest owns the words. The town owns the wood dot in gardens. The smallest rites wear aprons, salt on a threshold, a handful of grain to birds, because generosity used to be taught in crumbs. A broom stands bristles up when the floor is drying, and someone reads it as a sign that the home's spine is strong. A jug is turned toward the door, so luck does not get confused and feel trapped. Are these magic? The lane says this instead. They are ways to slow the mind long enough to do the next sensible thing. If a child asks why, the answer is tender. Because our people always have, and because sweeping with a song is easier than sweeping with worry. Autumn decorates with proof. Hops dry like parchment commas. Apples stagger into baskets. A last rush of dye work stains the yard cheerful. The field receives thanks with words that fit in a single breath, because workers prefer eating to speeches. A loaf is marked with a sign cut by a small knifer, simple sign, a road for steam. A sheaf stands in the porch for a day to let its importance be admired. Then it is threshed and becomes its responsibility. The church will preach about abundance with a parable. The market will preach about it with prices. Between sermons, the kitchen speaks constantly and convincingly. Winter returns with manners. Evergreen steps indoors to argue against geometry, and winds, lines soften. Windows smell like resin. Doorframes feel dressed. Candles are counted and placed, one for patience, another for memory, a third for those who cannot be present. A saint's day brings cakes made the way a household learned to count sweetness without waste. In some places, a star travels on a pole from door to door, and songs join the star like bells join a handle. In others, a single note from the tower tells the roof beams that the month is at peace with itself. Later centuries will layer their holidays and their skeptics. Tonight, you can simply watch your breath learn the meter of a prayer and call it health. Threshold customs multiply in cold. Whether a visitor is greeted with a hand to the doorframe, an old sign of welcome you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Shoes pause at a broom, then step over. The old joke about not bringing trouble across, getting its exercise in courtesy. A loaf leaves the house under cloth. A bowl arrives under cloth. The cloth gets more compliments than the food. Names are spoken aloud for those absent, as if names were keys that keep a room unlocked to memory. This is not theater. It is a house remembering its size. Church feasts fold over local habits like careful quilts. A procession enjoys walking the same lane a blessing walked in spring. A vigil borrows everyone's best candle and returns it with shorter hair. A field receives holy water from one person and a practiced glance from another. And the two gestures share space without argument. When a preacher warns against treating objects like levers, heads nod. When he invites herbs to be blessed and bread to be shared, heads nod again. The lane is good at nodding. It learned from years that nodding keeps markets open. There are nights when songs remember older words than the priest prefers. They are sung by old mouths with new grandchildren on their knees. And the compromise is to keep the volume low and the ending short. If you are worried about purity, history suggests you should sleep instead. Most of these layers behave like a good stewage ingredient, distinct and somehow improved by its neighbors. Scholars will write careful pages on syncretism. Benches will decide between another verse or another slice and choose the slice. What does any of this have to do with fear? Less than you think. Rites like these domesticate time. A town that can predict its own joys is slower to borrow panics from travelers. Fire on a hill reteaches scale. We are small, we can still be seen. Blessing fields and doorways expresses a theology you can walk. The holy is comfortable in the ordinary, and the ordinary deserves politeness. A year lived this way leaves fewer corners for rumor to curl up in. Step outside at the edge of one of these nights. The bonfire has learned humility and become embers. The evergreen holds its scent away. Paper holds ink. The latch clicks. The room holds a bell, sends a note that folds into the dark and makes the dark feel furnished. You're safe here, and so is the year handled, named, given household duties. That doesn't keep stories from traveling. Stories love roads. Soon, a printer will value speed over seasons, and images will learn to wear louder boots. The long echo is waiting in the next room. Pamphlets to pop culture, where pictures outrun porches and the broom becomes a logo. A woodcut learns a trick. It jumps from paper to memory. A rhyme learns the same trick and begins to walk around without its book. By the time a traveler carries both to the next market, the picture and the couplet feel older than they are. And a broom, a cat, and a pot have found work outside the kitchen. Printing liked pictures that could be understood from 3 steps away. Brooms read quickly, cauldrons read even faster. Cats were punctuation with whiskers. Printers learned which scenes sold. Night rides, crowded meetings, silhouettes, against the theatrical moon. None of this needed proof. It needed composition. Type set the accusation in neat lines. The woodcut set the mood. A reader with cold hands warmed them over the fire of the imagination and carried the scene into talk. Stories that once walked at the speed of feet learned to ride in saddlebags by the dozen. Song joined in. Ballads folded bold claims into verses. With agreeable rhymes, you could hum a rumor while stirring supper. Children learned choruses without needing the footnotes. Pamphlets loved to quote ballads. Ballads loved to echo pamphlets. The echo chamber was built of cheap paper and human appetite for tidy causes. Somewhere far from this noise, a clerk still wrote insufficient proof, but paper never brags about moderate sentences. Paper brags about storms. Then came the storytellers, who did not mean harm at all. Fairy tales needed a readable foil for clever children and lost princes. A woman at the edge of a forest, independent and oddly talented, made an excellent chapter partner. Cauldrons were already stage-ready. Cats were already graceful. Brooms were already on hand. Tales distilled the old anxieties into something friendlier to the nursery and easier to stage. Not every tale chose malice. Some offered helpful figures who lived alone and preferred exact payment in herbs or politeness. But the silhouette hardened. A pointed hat, a crooked roof, a kitchen. That did suspicious multitasking. These were portable. These were fun to draw. The stage and the fair hired the silhouette next. A festival needed a brisk cue for mischief, with a harmless smile. A traveling troupe needed a role that could be recognized before the 3rd drumbeat. Masks and makeup grabbed what pamphlets had already shaped and made it twirl. Audiences clapped when they were supposed to. Nobody meant a lawsuit. It is how images work. One century shouts, the next century quotes. The 3rd century sells cider mugs, with the outline on the front and a joke on the back. Illustrators learned to light windows from within, so roofs looked friendly and doorways looked decisive. Later, film loved that glow. Scenes borrowed from many centuries at once for the sake of mood. Medieval lanes for texture. Early modern panic for plot. 19th century hats because they flatter a camera. A soundtrack gave the moon a personality. A broom made a satisfying whoosh. The cauldron boiled on cue with a sound that good microphones like "You watched," felt your shoulders rise for 2 seconds, then laughed and let them drop again. Sleep did not suffer. Sometimes the picture tried on seriousness again. Novels and plays took the old accusations and asked what it feels like to be the person under a rumor. They found law as quiet as a ledger, neighbors as complicated as bread, courts both careful and sometimes too certain. A few creators went back to the rolls themselves, the town books, the church files, the depositions, and let those spare words suggest scenes more human than any woodcut could hold. Where the files were missing, they wrote with restraint, knowing that empty shelves can be honest. Meanwhile, historians kept their own slow magic, reading what people actually wrote when they were not on stage. Parish records, manorial rolls, sermons, legal handbooks, letters about butter and fences. They built maps of time and found the later spikes where many had imagined a flat medieval roar. They noted regions that stayed quiet when others did not. They sorted rumor from policy, policy from practice, practice from poster. Their method was not dramatic. It was closer to winter baking. Measure, sift, wait, check, try again. The result is flavor you can trust. Pop culture does not have to be scolded to be enjoyed kindly. It needs company. When a broom lifts off the floor on a screen, you can smile and remember the kitchen where it began. When a cat arches on a sill with theatrical intelligence, you can applaud the hunter under the fur and the ink under the myth. When a pot bubbles in silhouette, you can count soups, dyes, soaps, and baths before you count spells. None of this dampens fun. It adds layers. Layers make warmth. A calm checklist lives under your pillow now. written in invisible ink. Ask, which century is this picture borrowing from? If it answers several, nod. Ask, what would a ledger say? It would likely ask for the deed, the witness, the weather. Ask, what chores did this object do before the artist hired it? The answers will be brisk and domestic. Ask, who benefits if this story claims to be older than it is? Often the answer is paper, tickets, and the human desire for a clear villain. Ask kindly whether the lane might be full of good neighbors who simply had a bad week and an easy metaphor at hand. Respect also walks in the other direction. A child who loves the costume will want the story. Give them both, the cape for joy, the context for care. Remind them that many people across many traditions drew lines between blessing and bargaining, between hope and harshness, between help and harm. Remind them that modern, which can be an identity, a religion, a hobby, a role in a play. The medieval files did not know those categories, and the safest conversation begins by letting words choose their century. The echo keeps echoing. Every October, images adopt their sharpest hats. Every spring, fields accept blessings with practical patience. Every year a new novel borrows a moon, and a new historian borrows a quiet room. You can live comfortably between both, as long as you let porchlight and footnotes share the same sentence. You're safe here. Knowledge and play can keep each other company. Return, once more, to the lane that started our walk. The bell settles, a door latch clicks, a broom stands, bristles up because the floor is drying. A cat claims a windowsill with the authority of a guild. A pot hums with something ordinary and good. Inside the church a candle steadies. In the market, a clerk ties a ribbon around a roll. On a bookshelf, a book with a hammer title sits next to a book that says, "Teach gently." Outside, a child, in a pointed hat, tries on a smile that will do for both mischief and kindness. If a story tomorrow tells you the medieval night was one long chase, you now have a lantern that says, softly, not exactly. If another story lets a kitchen be a kitchen and a ritual be a breath, you will recognize the kindness. The long echo becomes a lull rather than a shout. Close the door lightly. Let the year turn. Let pictures entertain and records inform. The lamp goes low. The lane holds deep can keep the last footnote and the first fairy tale together without quarrel.